It appears to be a close-up of the iconic mermaid with wavy hair and a star on her head. Instead of a crown, she wears a Russian headdress. Starbucks has not made any comments about the new coffee stores. I hope you're having a wonderful day. It's 12:06. This is KUOW News.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include DuckDuckGo, committed to making privacy online simple. Used by tens of millions, they offer internet privacy with one download. DuckDuckGo, privacy simplified at duckduckgo.com.
Welcome to Friday. Welcome to KUOW's Week in Review. I'm Bill Radke. I'm your host of this program where we catch you up on what happened during the week, something maybe you missed, maybe something you have questions about. My panelists are journalists, so they ask questions too, and they find out stuff, and they know stuff, and we tell you stuff. And I'm so happy to have the Strangers City Hall reporter, Hannah Krieg, with us again today. Hi, Hannah.
Hi, how are you?
Great, thank you. We've got Geekwire's contributing editor, Mike Lewis, in the studio. Mike, we haven't had anybody in the studio besides me in years, I guess.
I am thrilled to break that seal for you folks.
Thank you.
Back in the studio.
Thanks for being our seal breaker and being on the show. We've got Crosscut Central and Eastern Washington reporter Mai Hoang, who is not in the studio with me. Far from it. I think you're in Yakima, right, Mai?
Yep. It's a 2.5-hour drive and a mountain pass away. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, I don't blame you for not making the commute in this morning. It's okay. Glad to have you all. And, you know, I can see my crew here because we stream the show live on YouTube and Facebook. So come see us, either of those places. Just search KUOW Public Radio. Okay, let's review the week. We're going to begin this show by going from money to ugly to slow in the next, 10 or 15 minutes. So part one, money. We are used to a booming Seattle, which means a booming tax collection and booming spending. But the pandemic has been expensive, growth has slowed, and Seattle has a budget deficit. This week, I read in Publicola that the city's budget chair wants to, again, take some revenue from the JumpStart payroll tax and put it into the general fund budget for the fourth and fifth years in a row. Hannah Krieg, the payroll tax, the JumpStart tax is supposed to fund affordable housing. Is the city breaking a promise and raiding that tax, or is this kosher?
I mean, they're technically allowed to do it. They've done it before to fill in the gaps that COVID left. But I mean, even Mosqueda seemed pretty disappointed in the Publicola article about this tax that was meant to do a certain thing and fight for a certain thing, and now will not go entirely to that thing.
Right. And just to remind listeners, this is a tax that big employers pay for all their Seattle workers who make at least $150,000 a year. So why, can you give us a thumbnail of why Seattle is in a deficit and what this money is going to be used for besides affordable housing? Maybe that's too big a question.
I don't remember why they're in a deficit. There's a lot of reasons.
Yes, the pandemic has been expensive, and I think growth has sort of plateaued. But what you've written about this topic of affordable housing and where the money's going to come from, what is the calculation that goes into that, and how does it affect the mission of getting more affordable housing built in Seattle?
I mean, we need money for affordable housing. This was the way we're going to do it. And now they're going to spend it on other things while they allow other departments to spend however much money they want. So,
yeah. And we're going to talk about some of the challenges to getting affordable housing built that you've written about, Hannah. Mike, you've also talked about a reaction you're expecting from the business community to this.
Well, yeah, the business community was pretty strongly in opposition to this tax. The tax went through anyway. My guess is that the business community, led by the Seattle Chamber of Commerce, are going to definitely push back again and say, well, look, they're not even spending the money on affordable housing. And that's always been the big issue in Washington state. I mean, this desire to sort of changing the tax regime, because we've got a pretty regressive tax system, if not the most regressive tax system in the United States. And so there are these other pockets that we go for, from the capital gains tax to this sort of thing. But the thing is that I think when we've run into trouble, certainly in the courts historically, it's been when there's not been a nexus, a consistent nexus between what the tax is supposed to go for. Everyone remembers car tabs, for example, a few years back, and what the tax is actually going for. And I think that's the problem that this issue illustrates, is that, all right, well, everyone got behind, or many people in Seattle got behind this idea of taxing higher salaries to make money, to collect money for more affordable housing. And then it's just going into the general fund. I think that there's probably a group of people who are going to be a little unhappy about that.
Yeah. And Hannah, is the mayor of Seattle going to propose new, Mike mentioned our regressive taxes here. Is the city going to levy more progressive taxes?
Yeah, in the public COLA article, it sounded like they're looking into other options. We already know the other options from a 2018 task force. Doesn't seem like something we need to spend a ton of time looking into, because we could set up a local estate tax, a tax on excess compensation, and a tax on real estate speculation, as Erica wrote in the public COLA article.
Yeah. And now I said we're going to move from money to ugly. So part 2, ugly. We want our housing in Seattle to be affordable, and we would like it not to be ugly, which is one reason that Seattle has a design review board to check how a new building looks, the quality of its materials and landscaping and open space, and how it fits with its surroundings. But Hannah, why do some people want to eliminate design review when it comes to affordable housing projects?
I mean, it just slows us down in production. You know, a design review board, that can take months, that can take over a year to get a project through the process, which is usually done by a volunteer board who use like 104 guidelines and some like neighborhood standards to come up with what they think is quote unquote attractive. And you know, there is this like tension of like, well, if we're going to live with these buildings forever, they should be pretty, but we have a design review board right now, and we still have ugly buildings right now. So it doesn't necessarily guarantee every time we're going to have buildings that appeal to everyone, because that's impossible to appeal to everyone, because our standards are informed by culture and all sorts of things. So it seems like a big waste of time to a lot of people.
You pointed to the concern about people taking shortcuts on design, and is that going to result in affordable housing that isn't what we want?
Yeah, I mean, I think my point I was sharing with you is just that, I mean, there's already kind of a stigma. There's an attitude about NIMBY with affordable housing. People don't really want affordable housing. You know, people who aren't and non-affordable housing don't want affordable housing near their houses. A better designed, you know, affordable housing makes it more palatable, you know, for the general public. And so if you take away these design standards and people are like, okay, I can kind of cut corners a little bit, it might result in some really ugly housing. And I know Hannah just said like we have ugly housing, but I think, you know, it's almost like just because there's still ugly housing, and that means it'll just be more ugly housing, you know, if people can take corners. So that's kind of my sense of it.
Yeah, I'm sorry to step on you at the end there. I'm curious. It's a good point, Maya. And Hannah, what do you think of that?
I mean, I think like I get what you're saying, obviously, but it's like having this like sometimes 2-year long process doesn't guarantee it's going to be nice anyway. And a lot of times, if you've been to one of these design review boards, it's 5 people, mostly white people, telling the developer what it should look like. I went to a meeting where they were like spending considerable minutes talking about, well, should we put a paint strip around the door? And obviously, I don't know if that is in your mind cutting corners with design, but it's
definitely not. I'm definitely not like saying I definitely am on board of not having excessive standards. And that, I mean, it sounds like there's issues of excessive standards. I think there's a difference between having standards and being excessive with them. And so, yeah, if they do eliminate the design review board because there's excessive standards, that's understandable. I think the key thing is to have that conversation of, okay, so what are our standards? How do we enforce it? And then and I guess on the like developer end, how is it manageable for developers so they're not spending an arm and a leg trying to meet these standards?
Right. And there is like administrative design review, which some affordable housing projects have been able to go through, especially during the pandemic. And that's a little bit quicker and kind of satisfies that need you're like getting at. It's usually just one person who's a staff person who says, well, these are the guidelines, and tries to apply those to the housing project. So that's kind of the happy medium that some people like.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I see that in my community here in Yakima Valley, that, it seems like the administrative review seems to be kind of a good happy medium that works in a lot of communities. So that makes sense.
Okay, interesting. Any reaction, Mike, or question?
Yeah, I actually got a question for the group. Anyone else here see Show Me a Hero on HBO?
No.
Familiar with that? All right, so that was a show. That's a David Simon show. David Simon's the guy who brought you The Wire. This was a docudrama, I guess, but based on a real case at Yonkers, New York. I think it's 1980. It's the United States versus Yonkers, New York. And it was all about the requirement in Yonkers to actually place subsidized housing within and integrate it within neighborhoods, because Yonkers was a pretty racially divided city at that particular point in history. And the mayor who had to see this project through against massive opposition. It is a lesson in U.S. history, but particularly about housing, subsidized housing, and affordable housing. It talks a lot about that. And I think that the design review boards historically came about because when we started building housing projects in the big cities, they turned into these areas that enhanced poverty and enhanced racism. They did not actually defeat it in any way, even though they were part of this whole, Johnson's Great Society program, right? So the design review was to make these projects actually work a little better within the communities. Now, I agree. I think there's been some mission creep here, right? There's been these standards that really shouldn't get down to the striping on a door, but maybe standards that should make these things look good in a neighborhood, so everyone's happy with the place they're living in, and don't create this sort of like, oh, that's the affordable housing and this is the less affordable housing, and these clear demarcation lines. And I think that's what design review at its best is supposed to do. But I'm not sure in Seattle whether or not it's actually been accomplishing that. But to Mai's point, I think maybe an examination of what is the review process should probably precede canceling the review process.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's exactly my point. And I definitely I haven't seen that show, but I've definitely read a lot about housing projects in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and just, exactly.
Right.
Yeah. And they're miserable. And it really enhances poverty. And that's why, people have the stigma about affordable housing, because they have seen what the past looks like.
Hannah, I've heard that design review and also environmental review can be used to slow a project down for reasons that don't really have to do with its paint or its environmental impact. Is that at play here?
I mean, I don't know if there's like a nefarious necessarily like motivation, maybe, but it definitely does. And it's not just affordable housing. It slows down all housing and all projects by a long time. And there is like beliefs that sometimes these affordable housing things are like held to higher standards because of the NIMBYs who don't want in the neighborhood anyway. And so the city has been trying to get rid of it. It's pretty like universally, not universally, but there's a ton of people on council who want to make exemptions or reforms for affordable housing projects to go through design review, so we can just get it done quicker. And we have a task force looking into doing it. That task force has kind of got delayed. You can check out, I wrote a big story about that at The Stranger.
Yes, at thestranger.com. I asked our KUOW's Community Feedback Club about this, and some comments I got included from Nick in Maple Leaf, who says, because design review has to follow a legally enforceable standard, they've come up with a set of rules that may or may not result in a good building or urban environment. You could probably look at every rule in the design review manuals and find a building considered an architectural masterpiece that violates that rule. Sarah in San Juan Island says, affordable housing isn't affordable to the homeowners or the earth if it has high energy costs or it's shoddily built, so it becomes a tear down and ends up in the landfill before its time. Sustainability must be part of the project, even though that may increase upfront costs, and without some oversight, these goals are unlikely to be achieved. So, by the way, you can become part of our Community Feedback Club, and all you do is just text the word club to the phone number 206-926-9955. And we want to know what you think. Just text club to 206-926-9955. I'm Bill Radke. This is KUOW's Week in Review. We made our move to part 3, moving from money to ugly to slow, as in slowing down housing projects. And now, before we take a break, I want to catch you up on something else that happened this week. Because housing expensive here, right? So what if the CEO of a Seattle company cut his own salary from $1 million to $70,000 a year so that he could pay everyone at his company $70,000 a year so they could afford a place to live? Well, that was the national news-making move that you may remember from 7 years ago by a guy named Dan Price, the CEO of a Seattle financial services company called Gravity Payments. Mike, Lewis, that act, that self-sacrificial act made a national celebrity out of Dan Price, aka Corporate Jesus.
Right.
Why did he quit this week?
Wow, this story is a long and complicated one, but I'll get it in brief. So this is a guy who he ended up on the cover of Forbes. He ended up on Oprah. He ended up on all the talk shows, all the big magazines as the new type of progressive CEO when he announced the minimum wage at his company. It employs about 240 people in Ballard. The minimum wage was going to be $70,000 a year, and people celebrated justifiably if that was actually true. I think there's been a little bit of funny math regarding the specifics of that, but I think a lot of people at the company did get raises, and he dropped his own literal compensation lower, although he was still retained ownership of the company. But there had been, even at that point, allegations from an ex-wife about physical abuse, and there had been allegations from employees that he was a pretty volatile guy, that he wasn't this corporate Jesus, if you will. And those things,
I didn't make that up. That was a very common Dan Price moniker.
No, that was
time,
absolutely. No, that was a social media meme about him.
Yes.
And also because he's longish hair and the beard, and it kind of looked like it, right? So he got that flared up. He actually, behind the scenes, was criticizing local journalists who even reported on the fact that he had some black marks in his history. But then it kind of died down, and then it went very quiet, and he through social media kind of rehabilitated his image. And again, he was here introducing Andrew Yang during the presidential election. He's moved back into the forefront of progressive corporate savior idea. But then this happened. A couple of things. One, a great story in Geekwire from earlier in the spring about him. Now he's in the out dating, and him in the with a woman who he went out on a date with, and then kept her essentially trapped in his car and tried to kiss her. When she tried to get out of the car, he apparently choked her. That became a misdemeanor charge. And then most recently with a woman who was a woman he contacted again through social media. They got to be friends. They started up a relationship, and her allegation, in fact, is rape. And this is the thing that once the New York Times called him about this is earlier in this week, Karen Weiss, who did a phenomenal story on this, really highly detailed story
in the New York Times.
When she called, that's when he went and informed the employees and the board that he is resigning, and saying that these are baseless allegations. His defense is that this didn't happen the way she said it did.
And he pled not guilty to that assault and reckless driving.
Absolutely.
Charge.
And he is saying that, but he had to resign, so he's not a distraction for the company, and he needs to now step aside so he can focus on refuting these allegations. That's where we are with that.
Yeah. Let me turn it to Hannah, or my reaction to this. I'm sure you remember Dan Price very well.
Yeah, I do. I see him all the time. As Mike said, he's on social a lot. He's frequently retweeted. I see his tweets on my timeline all the time because his tweets just hit hard. He has a large platform now. He says things people want to hear. People want to hear about employees deserving pay. People want to hear about getting higher salaries. People want the idea of a compassionate, generous CEO, because the narrative has been that CEOs are overpaid. They don't care about the employees. Employees treat them bad. But to just be honest, this is just my opinion, but I always felt uneasy about that. I always felt uneasy that there's one guy kind of leading this movement. I think with any sort of movement, whether it's like the $15 an hour minimum wage that kind of happened a few years ago, or just any worker movement, I mean, there has to be buy-in and involvement from like a mass amount of people. And I think for me, Dan Price was kind of like a one-man band with this issue, and like he kind of became the face of the issue, and that's never a good thing, because then that person is like on a pedestal, and that's just not a good idea. Like you to make something stick, there has to be broader involvement, and it has to be about the idea. It can't be about the person behind the idea.
Hannah, I see you nodding.
Yeah, I mean, I think the comment about the pedestal thing is just like all of the news I read about this, or a lot of the local news I read about it was, oh, the one good CEO did a bad thing and now he's resigning. It's like, it was kind of frustrating to see like his like good deed was always what was led with. And then like, what a shock. Some rich guy did something awful. And it just like, it goes back to that pedestal thing of like, you know, like in a rape culture, this stuff, like everyone is capable of like doing this kind of stuff, and we can't put people on pedestals and expect, you know, it's like you have to be real about that. And I don't know, kind of, it's very disappointing.
And I sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, and I guess I want to add to the point about, I feel like as a journalist, you have to be a little skeptical when someone makes their entire public platform this one thing. And that's what they're literally known. That's all they're known for. Because you have to question, okay, are they actually, if they're spending all this time like on this image, right? Trying to promote this image, trying to cultivate this image, you have to question whether he's actually cultivating this work culture in reality. And that's why the allegations regarding how from the employees were very like caught my attention, because that tells me that no, or maybe not fully, he wasn't living out this work culture that he was constantly promoting on social media. And, you know, he kept getting all these hit tweets with all these things about, you know, the importance of doing these things. But then you have to be like, okay, is he actually doing these things?
Right. I mean, there's for I think a lot of people, I mean, we know this about Facebook, right? For example, or Instagram, that there is a gap between what's presented and the person's real life, right? You know, that's a common theme. In his particular case, that gap was massive. But I would also say that there were some local reporters who were working on this. The folks at Todd Bishop at Geekwire early on identified the fact that this is not a pattern of behavior that was like good guy suddenly makes a wrong turn. This was a pattern of behavior. They interviewed a dozen women, I think Karen Weiss did in the New York Times, who said similar things about him when they were dating him, like a really super, like they said that he felt predatory when they were around him. And his staff also talked about, you never knew which guy you were going to get. He could be very volatile and very mean to staff as well. And so his pattern of behavior, I think, had been established before this was a blockbuster story just yesterday in the New York Times. This led to his resignation, but I think that's entirely correct to bring up the fact that as a reporter, you have to be incredibly skeptical when we're getting one tiny view of someone and they are a much more complete person than that. And we focus on that one thing and retweet it and help them. I mean, because he didn't do this on social media by himself. He was aided and abetted by many people retweeting these sort of things and building him into this idea, and then reiterating on the same story about, finally, we have the CEO we've always wanted. It turns out we didn't.
Yeah, this is a long time coming. You're right, Mike. I mean, I read Todd's stories. I mean, that's why I was skeptical of him from day one. I'm thankful for this local reporting that took a critical look at who this guy is. And it's just unfortunate that it took this long for like the rest of the country, I guess, virtually, to realize what a lot of locals knew a long time ago.
Absolutely.
You're listening to KUOW's Week in Review. We're running through some of the big stories of the week, and we're going to take a short break here. We've got the Strangers City Hall reporter Hannah Krieg, and Geekwire's Mike Lewis, and Crosscut's Mai Hoang. And after a short break, Mai's going to tell us about an Eastern Washington city maybe coming up with a definition of prayer. So don't go away. We'll be right back.
Hey, KUOW listeners, this is Patricia Murphy. I'm so excited to celebrate National Radio Day with you. It's humbling to be part of such a long-standing tradition. Become a monthly member at any level and ensure our communities have access to this vital resource. Visit kuow.org/radio. And thanks.
It's KUOW's Week in Review. You're hearing it. Maybe you're watching it if you're on YouTube or Facebook, because we live stream the program. You just search for KUOW Public Radio. I'm Bill Radke, and as I said, I'm with The Stranger's Hannah Krieg and Geekwire's Mike Lewis and Crosscut's Mai Hoang in Yakima. And you cover Central and Eastern Washington. The Kennewick City Council voted this week in support of beginning its meetings with a prayer. And now, as you said, they're going to need to define prayer. Will you tell us the story?
Yeah, so the city council voted 5-2 to start its meetings of prayer, and I guess just start the process of what that would look like, what it would involve. And basically it was a notable development because Councilman John Trumbo actually tried a few years ago to get this approval, and it was a different group of council members who did not approve this. So it's noteworthy that he came back, tried again, and was successful. I think for me, what interests me about the story is that there's just been a lot of conversation, not just at this local level, but there's been a lot of, I think some of you might be familiar. I mean, this is a slightly different case, but there was a Supreme Court case involving Bremerton football coach Joseph Kennedy that was in his favor regarding his ability to say a prayer on the football field. So that's a different matter, but I think it's related in the sense of what is appropriate as far as prayer. What can you do? What's considered public prayer? What's considered private prayer? How do you define it? How are you inclusive? I mean, I think this is a hot conversation topic. So for me, reading that story really kind of prompted those thoughts, and for me, this idea of like public prayer and what's allowed. I think at one time, no one would have blinked an eye at public prayer at a city council meeting, but now we're kind of in this age where we have to think a little more critically about it.
Do you know who would give the prayer, or whether it's going to be a moment of silence, or is this just all to be worked out?
So actually with the moment of silence, actually the members who opposed this proposal wanted a moment of silence. They felt like a moment of silence would kind of be a pretty non-religious way to do what they wanted. So the reason the argument that supporters are bringing up with this prayer is that prayer is this positive, feel-good thing. It promotes unity, gets everyone in this kind of positive mindset. I know it sounds kind of wild, but that's kind of the argument, this mindset, so they can get stuff done during city council meetings. And the ones that opposed it, and proposed a moment of silence, said, hey, well, why do we have to call it prayer? Can't we just have a moment of silence? It's, everyone can do that. It's not required. And then they kind of fired back being like, well, that's not the same. It's a watered down version. Like, we need prayer, like specific prayer. So that was how the top of this discussion went. So they claim that it's not going to be strictly Judeo-Christian. They claim that as they're talking and proposing kind of the parameters, that they would invite different religious groups to come in and give the prayer. So that's the claim. Again, it's kind of early, so it's hard to say what it's going to look like in reality.
Okay. Any reaction to that, Hannah or Mike? Reaction or questions?
I got a question. So we don't know how they're going to, you said, I think that we don't know how this is going to be implemented, correct?
Yeah, I mean, they have, I think the general idea is that at the start of the meeting, someone will give an invocation. I mean, that's the general, like, basic, but in terms of who or what the contents of the prayer, I think that's still to be determined.
And has the city attorney weighed in on this, or is the city attorney not weighed in on this?
No, I think that's part of the formal policy process. So
yeah. We'll be hearing more.
Yeah, I imagine we will.
Congress opens with prayers. Seattle City Council does not.
There's cities around the country that do.
Yeah, I mean, Yakima, the city Yakima, they do an invocation. So I mean, this isn't unusual by any means. It's just, I just think it's just in the limelight because there has been a lot of conversation regarding, the role of prayer and its appropriateness in civic life at this point in time.
Yeah, thanks for writing about it. I noticed some people there called it, as you said, this would be a moment of unity. This is prayer would bring us all together. And some people said the exact opposite, that this would be a moment of division.
Yeah.
Moving on the week in review here, this week, the mayor of Port Townsend proclaimed that that city values its transgender residents and visitors and urges all residents and visitors to be respectful, welcoming, and kind to everyone, regardless of gender identity. End of quote. Hannah Krieg, what happened that prompted that proclamation?
Yeah, so in the city of Port Townsend, there was a situation that happened at the local YMCA. There was a woman, I think she's like 80 or something, and she thought this 18-year-old employee didn't belong in the women's locker room. The employee is a trans woman, and the 80-year-old woman told various news outlets that she asked about the young woman's genitals, and then when that employee said it's none of your business, she asked the employee to leave. And then this interaction, the older woman violated the YMCA's policy, so they kicked her out and banned her from the pool. And then she told the media, and it put a big spotlight on Port Townsend, probably a bigger spotlight than they're used to. And the mayor and the city council decided we're going to take a stand with the young employee and other trans people. And that's not nothing, like when you think about all the really vicious responses that this story has gotten for the city to stand up for the employee like that.
I had not heard about this until a transgender acquaintance of mine in that area sent me the information about it. But you pointed out, Hannah, that this was a big deal, mostly in conservative media, that this went all around the country.
Yeah, definitely a big deal in conservative media. And definitely, like, when we report about it, we've written 2 stories about this situation at The Stranger, and the story I wrote got more comments than our endorsement package, which is our like most read thing. So it's just like, this is a topic people really care about. It's a topic that a lot of conservatives really care about, and it gets really, really heated really quick. So though the proclamation was symbolic, I think that a lot of trans people, especially the ones that were at the meeting, really appreciated the sentiment.
Well, that was my final. I want to turn it over to Mike and Mai, but the proclamation that the city of Port Townsend values its transgender residents and everyone should be respectful and welcoming, that seemed awfully mild to me. I wondered, was that a surprising proclamation? Does it have any practical effect? Does it affect anything at the YMCA? What effect did the people of Port Townsend think it will have? Will you tell me more about that, the reaction to that proclamation?
Me? Yeah, well, it doesn't have like any, like, there's not a law that says this woman is bad. You know, it's like, it is a proclamation, and it's a symbolic measure. And it doesn't really affect things at the YMCA. This already violated the YMCA's policy. The YMCA was very much on the side of their employee. But I'm sure that like other jurisdictions, the city, the YMCA itself, or the state could find some ways to protect trans people if they want to do something more concrete. I haven't heard anyone from Port Townsend like suggest anything. There wasn't any like suggestions of this is the concrete policy that would change the culture that makes a lot of trans people afraid to use the locker room or bathroom that aligns with their gender. We do have like discrimination policies in Washington state, but if there was, I look forward to any conversation from folks about what more could be done.
Yeah, and just to state what might or might not be obvious, but there's no link. I've never heard of any kind of link between inclusive bathroom policies and safety in a bathroom, but it's just something that keeps being brought up in conservative media. Any Mai or Mike question, reaction?
Yeah, I guess to jump off to your point regarding the bathroom option, I think an important point that gets lost in all this is that it's not like the Y had like one bathroom and that was the only bathroom this 80-year-old woman could use. Like from what I read, it sounds like the woman could have used, like, I guess they have some family bathrooms or some gender neutral bathrooms. So if she felt really unsafe and did not want to be in that presence of that person for whatever reason, she could have just walked away. Like the fact that she called attention to this person says a lot, I think. And you know, and I think the reality, like if you go, I've been to my local YMCA, it's pretty easy to like get away from people. Like if you really are not comfortable with someone, like if you're in a gym or you're anywhere and you don't feel comfortable with someone, you literally can walk away. Like it's not like this teenager was like over this woman's face or something. I mean, you know, I mean the way that the narrative sounds, it makes it sound like this young person was like in her face and threatening her, or like, you know, and that's the narrative that's being told. And I think even though the proclamation from how I see it, the proclamation was symbolic, I think it says, hey, this young person is still a citizen of Port Townsend. Like this person still has individual rights. Like you cannot just come up to this person and get in their face and ask them really personal things and like, and you know, kind of harass them a little bit. So
yeah, I'd add just a couple of things to that. I agree. I'm just waiting for some city somewhere to put out the exact opposite proclamation, because you know that's going to happen. You know that there's going to be some sort of resentment about this kind of thing. But the second thing is that we're dealing with a couple of things here. We're dealing with people's own internal adjustments about how the world is changing around them, because we've structured everything, as we've all said, in a very binary way, certainly when it comes to restrooms and showers and whatnot. And I think this is not just a YMCA thing, but I think every business, every place where there's public restrooms are going to have to start thinking about how are you structuring this, and do you have a structure that actually works in today's society, or do you need a structure that actually is much more you know, either inclusive or allows for variations now that we are adopting and that we are considering and that we're thinking about that didn't exist prior. And I think that part of what we're dealing with here are some actual logistical problems, as well as, you know, social ideas and standards that have been changing rapidly, and I think in really good ways. But we're going to keep running into this conflict until we start maybe building things a little differently.
You're reminding me of the binary in men's and women's sports and the questions about how much testosterone qualifies, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, this is KUOW's Week in Review. Before we take a break, one more story from this week, Mike. We found out that Seattle's mystery of the missing texts is not a cold case. The King County Sheriff's Office is investigating whether former Mayor Jenny Durkin, former Police Chief Carmen Best, or others broke the law. Will you remind us what happened and why this investigation was not a foregone conclusion?
Wow. So before I get into that, just a quick shout out to Louis Cam. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter. It was a great report at the Seattle Times. Now he runs, he co-partners on the Axios newsletter, and he's been covering this for Axios as well. What happened was this: during the protests, which were during the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter protests and other protests, and the Chop Chaz situation in Capitol Hill, that whole period involved a lot of really high-pressured police work. Some of the responses were strongly criticized. Other people felt the police should do more. But for some reason, the people in charge of that situation, primarily we're talking about former Mayor Jenny Durkin, former Police Chief Carmen Best, all of their text messages during this period, which are supposed to be preserved as public record, disappeared. The reasons varied. I think Mayor Durkin said she dropped her phone in water or something like that.
Salt water,
something like that. And then Carmen Best also just had a habit, she said, of deleting old texts. Well,
if she decided that they weren't relevant.
If they decided they weren't relevant, and certainly there's nothing relevant about police, a whole entire police precinct withdrawing from a neighborhood. Couldn't be relevant. So this thing, but no one seemed to want to push it. And I think it's in part is because it would have to have been the Democratic structure in the state to push it, or maybe locally. Well, finally, because I think Lewis has continually been reporting on this, it is now actually getting the attention that it deserves. And now the county is going to start investigating what happened to these text messages and why. Remember, this also involved the Seattle Times actually filing a lawsuit against this like lack of response to public records requests, which has been endemic in this area anyway. Personally, I think this is a very interesting story. And I do think, because remember, there's lawsuits regarding the police response to these events, these text messages are germane to those. And so getting them, are they recoverable at this point? No. Does a mayor who's a former U.S. attorney who helped write the consent decree not know public records laws in Washington State?
No.
Seems a little unusual to me.
Any reaction questions from Hannah or Mai?
Yeah, I'm laughing. I actually wrote a note to you guys about this, is that it feels like every time I show up on this show, we're talking about someone deleting texts every time, literally.
Yeah, it doesn't go away.
And I do want to speak to the broader issue that Mike kind of touched on, is this idea that that we're in 2022 and public officials still think it's okay to offstate or delete text. Like, that is ridiculous to me. I think kind of related, not related in terms of text, that there is also another story this week that there's a lawsuit against the Redistricting Commission for a similar issue, where they're saying that they actually withheld public records to hide offensive text. So this is a chronic issue among public officials in the state. So it's not
State
just
legislators not allowing access to their calendars, et cetera. Yes, you're right.
Yeah. So I think the story is interesting to me, like Mike said, because I think it's not going to end. I think people are going to push for transparency from public officials.
Did we mention that? My thought was, well, why it's strange that why hasn't it been investigated? Well, the King County prosecutor said, well, nobody referred it to us.
Yeah, which is I think sort of a little bit of a specious excuse. I think there wasn't really the desire to do it, and now, because it's not going away, there is a desire to do it. So great, that's all they need. And now that it's going to be very interesting to see how this investigation goes and what it uncovers. My guess is what it's not going to uncover is the actual text messages.
Mm-hmm.
What it is going to uncover, hopefully, is whether or not there appears to be an intent regarding the deletion of the text messages. But I find it pretty implausible that the people given their jobs did not know what they were doing when these text messages disappeared, or when your phone accidentally falls off the ferry into the Puget Sound.
Yes. One more factor. Isn't the King County prosecutor leaving his job?
Yes.
Okay. So after he leaves, will this investigation be mysteriously and quietly dropped into salt water and disappear? We don't know.
We don't know yet.
Okay. KOW's Week in Review. We need to take a short break so that we can touch on a few more stories of the week and leave you with a reason to smile. So let's do that. Don't go away.
Support for KUOW comes from BECU, a member-owned credit union putting people over profit, offering financial services and support to the community with access to local financial centers, over 30,000 ATMs, and online resources at becu.org. Federally insured by NCUA.
KUOW's Week in Review. I'm your host, Bill Radke, with Crosscut's Mai Hoang, The Strangers, Hannah Krieg, and Geekwire's Mike Lewis. Mai covers Central and Eastern Washington. Mai, when I think east side of the state in the summer, I think, how are the fires and how are the apples and cherries? And last week, we told listeners the fire situation is a lot better than last year. How about the fruit?
So yeah, I'm actually working on a story for Crosscut that's coming up next week, updating on the cherry crop. So kind of the sad news is that cherries have been a little bit hard to come by. So if you're a big cherry fan, you can still find the cherries. There's just was a lot fewer of them this season. Basically, we had kind of this weird spring. I don't know if you remembered in April, in Eastern Washington, there was there was snow in April.
Yeah.
And so basically created these very bad pollination conditions. So a lot of the cherries on the trees did not pollinate. And so the crop was already going to be small. Like typically we get a crop of anywhere like 20 million boxes, 20 million 20-pound boxes of cherries. We were looking at like 13 to 14 million because of this issue. And then now the numbers are around 12, almost 13 million. So that's like a huge cut in the volume of cherries. And so that's created a lot of havoc in terms of like displays, retailers want these big fancy fruit displays in their grocery stores, and if there's not as many cherries out there, it creates a lot of they have to put something there, and they can't put cherries there. So that's been the challenge. And so now we're approaching apple season. You should be seeing farmers start to harvest apples later this month into the fall, and they're predicting us, not surprisingly, a smaller crop compared to 2021. So they're looking at 108.7 million 40-pound boxes, which is an 11% decrease. So it's a sizable decrease, but not as bad as cherries. But yeah, basically just not as much fruit out there to enjoy.
Okay, sorry to hear that. Fortunately, the Rainier cherries were delicious. Now I feel guilty that I ate some.
Yeah, I mean that's the kind of silver lining, is like if you got hold of the fruit because the crop wasn't as big and there was not as much fruit on the trees, that kind of gave the fruit that was on the trees room to develop flavor. So generally, when there's a smaller crop, the size of the fruit is actually really nice, and the fruit's really good. It's just the trade-off is there's not as much of it. So
okay, yes, Mike.
This story's been keeping me up at night, and the reason is because I am a huge fan of cherries, and I have a specific question for you. Does this mean all varieties of cherries, or just mean just specific varieties of cherries? Does it mean we're kind of doomed as far as cherries go?
I mean, I don't want. Okay, so I want to clarify that I don't want to make it sound like you need to go. Like you need to take a run on the grocery store. Like you probably can go
after the show.
Yeah, you probably can go to QFC. Actually, I interviewed one of the produce buyer cruises, and they're actually having some nice displays. We're also seeing, I think people sleep on other fruits on that wash and grows, like peaches and nectarines. We have actually a very robust peach and nectarine harvest, and so what? Yeah, so
it's not the same.
Yeah. So what they're doing, what these retailers are doing is they're actually combining, like they're doing like a summer fruit display. So they'll do like cherries and peaches and nectarines. So you can go to QFC, Mike, and you can go to and look for their big summer fruit display and buy your cherries.
But it's going to be a fruit cup. Warning
exactly.
you. Okay, we've just got less than 7 minutes left in the show. Mike, I graduated high school in 1982. I attended the School of Hard Knocks in Federal Way, and I did my extracurricular work at Chuck E. Cheese Pizza Time Theater at SeaTech Mall. This week, our state announced that high school students who have jobs will earn school credit for that work. Does that include serving pizza in a Jasper T. Jowls costume? Will you explain?
Well, I don't know if it actually requires that specifically, but what it is it is going to allow high school kids who get a part-time job in certain instances, hopefully in many instances, I don't know the specifics yet, about allow them to get class credit for this. And the reason that this is a good thing, it's a reason that this could be a good thing, is if universities take this class credit and the schools take this class credit and actually turn it into something that matters. It's not just getting class credit. This is a potential chance to equalize for the kids who actually have to work after school, which I had to do. I think you said that you did. I'm sure other people on the panel may have had after school jobs as well. I actually had to have mine. It allows you, when you do those things, you don't actually get to participate in all those curriculum vitae, all the processes that build your college application, the extra clubs, the volunteer work, all that kind of stuff. You can't do that if you're a kid, frequently from a lower income family. And maybe allowing this, and maybe then if universities take these part-time work-related class credits and apply them to an actual admissions standard, then it becomes a really important thing. I think short of that, it's not an important thing to get a class credit unless that class credit could actually leverage something additional.
Hannah, did you have a teenage job that taught you skills or wisdom that helped you in your young life and maybe should have applied toward graduation?
Yeah. In high school, I worked at Sonic Drive-In. I took orders. Huh?
Which one was that?
Oh, the one in Spokane. I'm from Spokane. The north. Gotcha. It was right when it opened, the north location. I learned a lot about how not to cry when being yelled at, which I'm still working on. But there's a lot of skills like multitasking and a lot of social skills you learn from jobs, and you do miss out on a lot of opportunities, like Mike said, if you're working, and even like you might do like worse in some homework. It might be good to like be able to offset the time with credit so that you can have a lighter load at school and like have a better balance in your life.
Yeah,
Agreed.
good point. Mai, you were nodding there.
Yeah, I agree. Because I also worked in an after school job, and I mean, I did some extracurriculars that kind of came during school, but pretty much my routine was go to school, work for 4 hours at my after school job, and then go home. So yeah, I love the idea of, maybe it lightens the school workload a little bit if you don't have to take as many electives to graduate.
At Dairy Queen, I also learned that they would only let me work in the back and burn my hands, while the girls got, as they called them, got to be up front, putting the swirls on the ice cream and talking to customers, which is what I wanted to do. So I learned about institutional sexism early on at Dairy Queen. Yeah.
So my job, I've worked in a variety of after school jobs, but one of my jobs was actually data entry. I worked for this company that did medical coding for insurance companies, and my job was to key in all these medical bills, and it's a very boring job, and it's all these numbers that you have to type in. So I can understand, how on the patient end you might get billed for something you shouldn't have gotten billed for, or your insurance company doesn't charge you or doesn't pay enough. Working that job made me understand why, because if you're keying all these medical bills, after a while, if you're not careful, you type the wrong number or wrong letter or something that creates issues.
We're down to 2 minutes left in the show, and I always like to leave something for you to smile about at the end of the program. So my nominee is the new coffee shops in Russia. Starbucks pulled out after the Ukraine invasion, so a restaurateur there reopened the Starbucks stores, but they're called Stars Coffee, and the logo is just slightly altered. It looks sort of like a sister of the siren, and she has the Russian headdress, the kokoshnik, I found out, with the star, and I'm guessing you can't get an Americano there, but otherwise it's sort of a rough equivalent.
Yeah, the interesting thing is, I don't know internationally how successful logo enforcement is going to be for Starbucks. Starbucks is pretty aggressive in that regard.
Yeah.
If anytime Starbucks sees anything that the way Disney is the same way, that pushes up against what they feel like is their trademark, they get pretty active, which they did in Seattle. People may not remember, but this was probably back in 2007. They got in a dust up, which they ended up losing with the Rat City Roller Girls, because Starbucks claimed that the Rat City Roller Girls logo, which was concentric circles, which exist on Target as well, but I guess the Rat City Roller Girls were a little easier of a target. They claimed that logo was in violation, and only when newspapers started writing about it did Starbucks back up and say, "Well, maybe we were misunderstood."
Wow, I don't know why I had not heard that.
You didn't want to tangle with the Rat City Roller Girls.
Do not. We have to. Anyone got a 5-second reason to smile before we have to leave?
I have something.
Yeah.
So this week I marked my 1-year anniversary at Crosscut.
Hey, congratulations.
Yes, and I spent many of my memories involved being on the show, chatting with you guys.
Well, thanks. Way to go, and thanks for having your excellent reporting be part of our show. Hannah, are you smiling at anything on the way out here?
My kitten learned how to get in the sink, and it's cute. So that's pretty good for me.
Is it like my cat only likes to lick out of the sink if it's drip, drip, drip. It's a stream. He wants nothing to do with it. Is any of that kind of shenanigans?
Yeah, exactly. You can't turn it on all the way.
That makes me smile. Thank you for being on the show. A Geekwire contributing editor, Mike Lewis, The Strangers, City Hall reporter Hannah Krieg, Crosscut, Central and Eastern Washington reporter Mai Hoang. Week in Review produced by Kevin Kniestedt, with social media and live streaming by Juan Pablo Chiquiza and Tio Popescu. Guy Nelson making it all sound great. Good to see Guy again running the board today. You've been listening to Week in Review on KUOW FM Seattle, KUOW Tumwater, and KQOW Bellingham, and we'll do it again next week. Bye. Thanks, team. Great job.
Support for
Who do we? Oh, Mike just turned off his laptop. Hey, that was great. Thank you, everybody. I know we did a lot of topics, and maybe I was a little rushed. I hope we didn't tax you. I always appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks away. I know it was a fun discussion, so I had a good time.
Thanks, everyone. Sorry, I closed my laptop.
Mike is yelling goodbye.
Yes, thanks, Mike. It's good seeing you again.
Thanks, you guys.
Thank you, Hannah.
Yeah.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.
Thank you. Thanks,
Bye.
Kevin. Bye.